What's going on, everybody? Josh Engleman for Awesemo.com, and I am back with my Week 12 FanDuel Top 5s. My top 5 tight ends, wide receivers, running backs, and quarterbacks for this Sunday. The Big 12 gamer, or at least we hope a Big 12 gamer. Now be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when this and all of our other content goes live. Follow me on Twitter at Josh Engleman so you can get updates to the sim results as we get closer to lock. And finally, just let me know in the comments section, who are your favorite options? Tight end, wide receiver, running back, and quarterback for Week 12 in the NFL. We're going to start with the tight ends, and honestly, it's pretty flat. 3 through 10 looking pretty similar, with two guys clearly at the top. So Jordan Reed, Jonnu Smith, Mike Gesicki, Hunter Henry, and Hayden Hurst all on the outside looking in. Here is my number 5 tight end for this week. And in what is essentially a tie with Hayden Hurst, 5.5% of the time, Noah Fant, 5,700, projected for 8.1 fantasy points, taking on the Saints. It's not a really good spot for Denver, and the Saints defense, pretty solid. Second against the run, 5th against the pass. Noah Fant is just simply easy to roster from a salary perspective. He's not going to kill you regardless of what he does. Probably doesn't have a massive upside, only goes for north of 25 fantasy points, 0.7% of the time. Like I said, the difference between number 5, number 4, number 3, very, very marginal this week. If you need to roster a tight end, don't be afraid to just look for a little bit of additional correlation. Or if you just need the salary savings, I think this week's a really good week to punt if you don't have one of my top 2 guys. Coming in number 4 at that same 5.5% number, that's $5,600 Evan Ingram. Ingram and the Giants taking on the Bengals. 5-point favorites, actually. 5.5-point favorites, in fact. Only a 44-point game total, which is kind of concerning, but what you lack in the huge total, you gain in the fact that the Cincinnati Bengals defense stinks. 23rd against the run, 28th against the pass. Evan Ingram, again, showing up in the optimal 5.5% of the time. Good luck separating Ingram, Fant, Hurst, Henry, Gesicki, Jonnu Smith. These guys all look super duper similar. We still have one more to go before we hit that upper tier. We do take that half step up though, going to number 3, Austin Hooper, 5,100, projected for 8.1 fantasy points. This is a good spot. Cleveland's got a date with Jacksonville. That's my first got a date. 6-point favorites, 49-point game total, and the 30th ranked pass defense. Again, you're not expecting monster performances out of someone like Austin Hooper, but 6.7% of the time, he is in the optimal lineup. Really difficult to get away from someone like Hooper because of the salary savings. But there are some guys you can spend up on. The first of which coming in at $8,000, 25% of the time showing up in the optimal lineup. That would be Travis Kelce, projected for 14.7 fantasy points at Tampa Bay. Monster game total, but tough spot. Number 1 run defense, number 2 pass defense in Football Outsiders DVOA. Travis Kelce goes for north of 25 fantasy points 8% of the time. That's a big number at tight end. Shows up in the optimal though, 25% of the time. I understand he's expensive, but he is well worth the price tag. That's why I have my eye on Travis Kelce, but he's still not number 1. By a hair, 25.8% of the time, 7,100. That would be Darren Waller, 13.6 fantasy point projection at Atlanta, a 54-point game total, and the 26th ranked defense. This spot looks fantastic. I'm not worried about Darren Waller at all here. Goes for north of 25, 7% of the time. There are clearly 2 primary options at tight end. Waller and Kelce showing up in the optimal lineup 50% of the time. They're going to make up a large chunk of your exposure, but for right now, by the thinnest of margins, I prefer Darren Waller. Wide receiver, on the other hand, looking a little bit different. We're pretty flat from 10 through 1, so don't get too hung up on the order. But number 10, Michael Thomas. Number 9, Jacoby Myers. Number 8, Calvin Ridley. Number 7, Robbie Anderson. And number 6 on the outside looking in is Tyreek Hill. Let us transition to the number 5 spot. At number 5, we are going to Keenan Allen, 8,200, shows up in the optimal lineup 13.8% of the time, projected for 14.4 fantasy points. In Buffalo, 5.5-point underdogs, but we do get the 52.5-point game total. Bills D, a little bit worse against the run, but still just an average pass defense. What you're looking for is the big day out of Keenan Allen. Greater than 25 fantasy points, 14% of the time. I think he can hang a pretty big number on the Bills. He's been fantastic this season. Really difficult to overlook. 4 more guys to go, though. First of which gets the benefit of playing the Jets. 6,500 for Devontae Parker, 12.7 fantasy point projection. Miami, 7-point favorites at the Jets. Only the 44.5 point game total, but when you're a 7-point favorite like this, you're making up most of that points. And the Jets are the worst pass defense in the league. Dead last, 32nd in passing DVOA. 8.8% chance that Parker goes for north of 25, but 14.5% chance that he's showing up in the optimal. This spot just looks great. Why would you want to pass up on anybody playing the Jets? I wouldn't want to start here. Parker, number 4. Now, if you want another fantastic matchup, but a bit more of a pay-up option, go to my number 3 guy, DeAndre Hopkins. He's 8,500, but he's projected for 14.5 fantasy points. This game is at New England. Arizona is a 2-point favorite with a 49.5 point game total against a terrible defense. Patriots 28th against the run, 31st against the pass. Where did this number 1 defense from last year go? They are long gone. Going for north of 25 fantasy points 16% of the time. Hopkins is on a completely different level. You guys know he's the type of guy that can truly break a slate. 15% of the time he's showing up in the optimal lineup. I think he looks like a really nice pairing with Devontae Parker because of Parker's price, but I still have 2 more wide receivers to go. At number 2, 7K, 14-point fantasy projection. That's Justin Jefferson. Taking on Carolina, 3.5-point favorites at home, a north of 50 game total, and a defense that ranks in the 20s on both against the run and against the pass. Jefferson has looked fantastic as a rookie. I see no reason it stops here. 13% chance of going for north of 25 and slightly more frequently showing up in the optimal than DeAndre Hopkins. The 7K price tag helps a lot. It's enough savings that lets you do a couple other things at the other positions. But we have 1 more guy to go. And at the risk of spoiling it, number 1, Stephon Diggs. We'll see his partner in crime at the top of another list, but 7,900, 14.4 fantasy point projection, taking on the Chargers at home, 5.5 point favorites, a 52.5 point game total, a middle of the pack pass defense, a terrible run defense, which could potentially open things up for that passing game. 16.6% chance of going for north of 25, 16.5% chance of being in the optimal, which is basically letting me know if Stephon Diggs goes for 25, you're going to need him. That's why he shows up in my number 1 spot, a full percentage point ahead of Justin Jefferson. I'm loving Diggs here. Gonna want to get that guy in your lineups. Now we transition to the running backs. There's going to be a very firm tier here in between 5 and 6, and then another between 3 and 4. So we got a little bit of separation at the running back spot. Rounding out the top 10, Kenyon Drake, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Nick Chubb, Kareem Hunt, and Gio Bernard on the outside looking in. 4 and 5 are pretty similar, so let's move straight to number 5. Number 5, we've got the workhorse Derrick Henry, 8,300, 15.5 fantasy point projection at Indy. Now they're 3-point dogs with a 51.5 point game total and a pretty difficult matchup. Indy's D 5th against the run, 6th against the pass, but I think Derrick Henry sort of transcends defense. Henry goes for north of 25 fantasy points 12.5% of the time. Shows up in the optimal 15.8% of the time. It's a big price tag, and that's what kind of scares me. You're kind of paying up to be contrarian for Derrick Henry. So pay close attention to his ownership as we get closer to lock. I think Henry could be an interesting pivot, but I have 4 guys that are ahead of him. The first of which, just barely edging him out for that number 4 spot, is Mike Davis. 7,200, projected for 13.9 fantasy points. Game is in Minnesota, so the dome is going to be pretty nice for Davis. 3.5 point dogs and a 52 point game total. We're expecting a lot of scoring. 19th ranked rush defense, that's helpful. 12th against the pass, that's not a problem. Goes for north of 25, 8.5% of the time. He's not the type of guy that we're worried about going crazy. What I'm looking for out of Mike Davis is the game where he goes for north of 20, and I think that's pretty frequent. Shows up in the optimal 16% of the time. I don't mind that $7,200 price tag at all, but we are about to take a step up in tier to number 3. At number 3, showing up in the optimal lineup 19.5% of the time, that would be Josh Jacobs. 8K, 15.5 point projection at Atlanta. Love getting him in the dome. 3-point favorites with a 54 point game total. Atlanta better against the run. They are ranked 10th, but Josh Jacobs is a little bit available in the passing game. 26th against the pass. Jacobs goes for north of 25 fantasy points 13.6% of the time. Like I mentioned before, this is where the tier starts. 1, 2, and 3 are all pretty similar, but there's a clear delineation between Josh Jacobs and Mike Davis. Jacobs, one of my favorite options. I'm going to have a ton. I usually have a ton. This week's no exception. Might need to take out a loan for this one. Number 2 at $11K. That's Dalvin Cook, projected for 20.2 fantasy points, taking on Carolina. Minnesota, slight favorites at home, 50-point game total, and a defense that's 22nd against the run and 21st against the pass. There's no reason that Dalvin Cook shouldn't be involved in everything that the offense is doing. This is a really scary spot for Carolina. Dalvin Cook goes for north of 25 points 31% of the time. Now, you're going to need that. 11K is no joke. That is a legitimately high price tag. But for someone with his pedigree, with the games that Dalvin Cook has had this season, I don't think it's crazy at all. You're going to need some Dalvin Cook in your life. Even though he's 11K, I think he looks fantastic. And finally, he's my number 1 on DK. He's my number 1 on FanDuel, 7,400. The man that broke my heart last week, that's James Robinson. 16-point projection, taken on Cleveland. Cleveland's defense is the dead middle of the pack. 15th against the run, 15th against the pass, just shy of that 50-point game total. Jacksonville, slight underdogs, but James Robinson's going to be involved, whether it's a running game or a passing game. He's just going to get that work. Goes for north of 25 fantasy points 13% of the time, but showing up in the optimal, north of 20%, 21.5% of the time. James Robinson, very clearly my number 1 running back for week 12. Now, before we touch on the quarterbacks, one last reminder. It helps me out a ton, guys. Please hit that thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel. We're trying to get to north of 50,000 before the year is end. We're gonna have before the year ends. We're gonna have to put our foot on the gas for that one. Subscribe to the channel, notification bell, and dive into the comments to let me know who you like, because now we transition to the quarterbacks. Now, as far as I'm concerned, I have one quarterback that stands above them all, but we got to talk about 4 others plus 5 others. So Tom Brady, Teddy Bridgewater, Cam Newton, Phillip Rivers, and Matt Ryan round out the bottom of my top 10. Don't be too concerned with the separation here. You can see only 0.7 of a percentage point separating Matt Ryan from Tom Brady. And honestly, 2 through 5 looking pretty similar as well. Number 1 is the biggie. We go to number 5, he's 6,800 in a tie with Matt Ryan and Phillip Rivers. That would be Tua, 19.3 fantasy point projection. This could be the breakout that you're looking for out of Tua. He gets the Jets, 7-point favorites, 44.5 point game total, and the 32nd ranked pass defense in Football Outsiders DVOA. Tua goes for north of 25 fantasy points, 21.5% of the time, but he's in the optimal only 5.7% of the time. It's really easy to just grab any quarterback you're looking for on this particular slate, but I like him. Pairs really nicely with Parker, but there are 4 more to go. And at number 4, we've got newly minted quarterback on FanDuel, Taysom Hill, 7,300, projected for 19.8 fantasy points. Saints are 6-point favorites, 44-point total. I don't want to say that Taysom Hill looked good, but you have so much rushing upside that you have to keep an eye on him. Two rushing touchdowns last week. The number 16 ranked rushing defense for the Broncos. Hill goes for north of 25 fantasy points 25% of the time, showing up in the optimal 6.5% of the time. I like going to Taysom Hill. I liked him a little bit more when he was a tight end, but even at quarterback, no reason to get away from him. Now at number 3, we've got a bit of a pay-up option, 9,100, projected for 22.9 fantasy points. That's Kyler Murray taking on the Patriots. Big game total, 49.5 points, and a terrible defense, 28th against the run. Clearly a giant benefit for Kyler Murray. 31st against the pass, certainly not going to hurt him there either. This is the big piece. He goes for north of 25 fantasy points, 36.6% of the time. We're expecting a big day out of Kyler Murray. This matchup does not get much better. And as you can see, he's a bit of a step above the Tua range. 7.7% of the time he's showing up in the optimal. We still have 2 to go, though. That first one is a big leap up. Number 2, 9K, 23.3 fantasy point projection. We're going to Pat Mahomes. It's a scary matchup. At Tampa Bay, the number 1 run defense, the number 2 pass defense, but a 55-point game total. And the Chiefs are favorites in Tampa. 44% of the time, Pat Mahomes goes for north of 25 points. He's just too good. Shows up in the optimal 8.7% of the time. I love taking Mahomes. I love stacking up the Chiefs. I certainly love grabbing some bringbacks from the Bucks. But even still, that's not enough to put Pat Mahomes in the number one spot. That number one spot at 11.3% likelihood to be in the optimal 8,600. It's Josh Allen, 23.2 fantasy point projection at home against the Chargers, a 5.5 point favorite with a 52.5 point game total. Now, Josh Allen can get it done on the ground. They rank 27th against the run, 16th against the pass. He's got a projection that puts him north of 25 fantasy points 44% of the time. Look at that graph. I love Josh Allen. To me, he is the clear-cut, no-brainer number one quarterback option. But he's only in the optimal 11% of the time, and that's the key takeaway here. It's not all that unlikely that it's somebody else you can get by, but if we're talking about frequency, Josh Allen is the quarterback most likely to be in the optimal lineup. Alrighty, folks, that will do it. Those are my top 10s at quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end for week 12 on FanDuel. Thank you for joining me. Best of luck this Sunday. Keep your eyes peeled to my Twitter for the sim updates, and watch me on NFL Strategy Show, 9 a.m. on Sunday, NFL Live Before Lock, noon on Sunday. Tons of content coming up. I'm excited for this slate. Let's hope we don't lose any games to COVID. Good luck, everybody.